Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are
hey, Molly.
recording. Are you, Molly, are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
Okay, everyone, I think we're gonna go ahead and get started. I'm really excited for this talk today. Welcome everyone to Balkan Circle. Today we have a close friend and colleague of mine. It's my pleasure to introduce him, Dr. Artan Hoxha, who is a historian of modern Europe with a regional focus on Southeastern Europe and the Mediterranean. He received his PhD in European history at the University of Pittsburgh in 2020. That was his second PhD, because he also received a PhD in Albanian and Balkan history at the University of Tirana in 2014. Artan has a strong thematic interest in the socio-cultural transformations that occurred during the 20th century, and his scholarship highlights the connections that bridge the East-West divide. His scholarly goal is to investigate the threads and shared historical patterns that link the countries of Southeastern Europe with each other and the wider world. He had a book that is forthcoming, although it's already up on Amazon, right, Artan?
Yeah.
Called Sugarland, the Transformation of the Countryside in Communist Albania, just coming out with CEU Press. And I read this book and it's totally wonderful. I highly recommend it. As well as a second book that came out last year, Communism, Atheism, and the Orthodox Church of Albania, Cooperation, Survival, and Suppression, came out with the Routledge. And it's actually a version of an Albanian language book on the same topic. And there's also an Albanian version of Sugarland as well, I believe. And one other book in Albanian that he wrote, the English title translates to A Historical View of the Development of Philanthropy in Albania, which came out in 2011. So Artan is very prolific and his work is wonderful. And so I'm really excited to hear his talk today. You can take it away, Artan.
Oh, all right, perfect. So start with, first of all, I'm not related to Enver Hoxha. Everybody asks me, are you related to him? I'm not. And ironically, I'm sitting in a bar, which name is Quo Vadis. As you all know, that's the title of a very famous book of Henryk Sienkiewicz. That means Quo Vadis Domine, right? And you can see here, it's the American, is the poster of Robert Taylor playing the character of Marco Vinicio and Deborah Kerr playing the character of Lydia. And across the street is Enver Hoxha's villa. So on one side of the street is the ex-villa of this very kind of a very fanatic Stalinist leader who made this country an atheist country in 1967. And now after the communism, we see across the street this bar with a very kind of a religious meaning. So I'm going to give this talk on Albanian Orthodox Church and its relations with the communist regime. That's the book. It came out this summer, actually. And regarding the other book on Sugarland, actually, there is a version in Albanian, but that's not of Sugarland. It's another thing. Are two different books. So the thing is that the reason why I want to actually give this talk is related. First of all, it's about PRing my book and talking a little bit about my book, but also because it connects with my future topic. So I want to give you a brief description of my trajectory. I started my work working on religion, and then I transitioned once I came to the US on the transformation of infrastructure. So I wanted to understand what happened, what kind of cultural policies the communist regime was pursuing, especially in a multi-religious country like Albania, because the Albanians are divided into four main denominations, two Christian and two Muslim denominations. More precisely, Catholics, Orthodox, Sunni Muslims, and Bektashi Muslims. And so the whole problem has been how to build a nation out of this multi-religious, of different religious groups. And so the idea of building nation in case of communism in Albania fit also with the ideological agenda of the regime. And so once working on that, I understood that actually there was more going on. So to understand modernization, nation building, and state building, we have also to go and see what happened with the infrastructure. So my second book actually went from the kind of from tracing the relations and the religious policy of the communist regime, also with its infrastructural agenda. And then my next book project is about atheism. So now I can jump into atheism by understanding how infrastructural transformations went hand in hand with the, let's say, I'm not a Marxist, but I'm using a Marxist terminology here. The infrastructural transformations went hand in hand with superstructural transformations. So I want to give this talk exactly because it connects with my second book, with my second PhD, but also with my third book now that I've started to work on. So when it comes to Albania, the thing as I described briefly a couple of minutes ago, the society is divided into four main denominations. And the thing is that when we talk about the Balkans, we all know that the line of Theodosius, so the division of the imperial of the Roman Empire into two blocks, actually crossed exactly in the Balkans. It started in Albania, it went through Bosnia all the way up to Hungary. And it is exactly across this line that we also see the major, let's say, conversions that happened, that occurred during the Ottoman Empire. Actually, if we see the concentration of Muslim populations in the Balkans, they are mainly concentrated along this line. And so the thing is that Albania, let's say, was established as a state exactly across this line, and that made the nation building a very complex and very difficult process. Actually, we can see what did happen in Yugoslavia, for example, in Bosnia. So the thing is that it was exactly because of all these reasons why I started thinking to work on the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox population is mainly concentrated in southern Albania. In northern Albania, Christians are generally speaking, with only few exceptions, are Catholics, because they are on the western side of the Theodosius line. When it comes to the Orthodox, they are on the east of that, which means generally speaking, they are concentrated in southern Albania. When it comes also to the social composition and ethnic composition of the Orthodox in Albania, it's the most multi-ethnic, actually, religious group. It has Greek-speaking. There's a Greek-speaking minority. It's tiny, but still, when it comes to its percentage within the Orthodox group, it's consistent. And there are also Slavic speakers. So the thing is, how then the state built this relation, and how the communist state kind of try to cope, and how try to kind of subordinate this denomination to its agenda. So, and while working on this project, I saw that the main paradigm when it comes to religious religious relations in the communist era, the paradigm is that of victim and oppressor. The oppressor is the state, the victims are the religious believers. So that's almost all the literature that I have consulted with. That was the most dominant and the most prominent paradigm. And that was especially true when you talk about Albania, which became the only atheist country in the world in 1967. Even communist China did not become an atheist state. Albania became in 1967 an atheist state. So that's very prominent when in the scholarship on state-religion relations during the communist era in Albania. But once I went to the archives, I saw that that was not the case, actually. That's not the situation is very complex. And what we can see and what I could see here was that, first of all, it's very hard to talk about communist state as a monolithic entity, and it's very hard to talk about the Orthodox Church as a monolithic entity as well. They are both cases, both these institutions were very kind of fragmented. And when it comes especially to the Orthodox Church, there were many kind of competing fractions fighting against each other. And so what we see actually since when the communists came to power, we see certain fractions which kind of were reluctant to cooperate with communist state and certain other fractions that were willing to cooperate with the communist state. And that and cooperation and resistance, if I can call resistance, but in both cases, we don't see any kind of ethnic line. We can see, for example, in the Greek minority, people willing to cooperate with the communist authorities, Albanian communist authorities, and other groups that were not willing to cooperate with them. And the same thing was also among the Albanian-speaking Orthodox. So what we see then is that in many cases, different competing fractions invited the communist state to become a mediator between these different competing groups. At the beginning, the communist state was not very willing and was not interested at all in subordinating the religious communities. And in fact, we can see that actually the communist state in the early years of its rule, let's say 1945, 1946, 1947, it only jailed and executed only few Orthodox priests. And that was also the case with the Muslim denominations. So the thing is, that was not very interested, because the only thing that the communist state wanted to do was to neutralize only the most prominent elements within the Orthodox Church that it, in a way or another, were reluctant to cooperate with the state. But that was all. It was not willing to really kind of transform the Orthodox Church. There was no kind of agenda in pursuing atheist policies. They were not well-defined anti-religious policies. Actually, the communist strongman, Enver Hoxha, but also his associates, actually did not envision any form of communist society in the early years of their rule. The only thing that they wanted actually was to establish and strengthen their rule over the society, but that was all. So we see this kind of very fluid, very complex situation. Many groups within the Orthodox Church actually embraced this vocabulary of revolution, and they were trying also to revolutionize the Orthodox Church and transform it into a kind of a revolutionary entity. And what we could see in this case is that the communist state was not very willing to cooperate with this group. Actually, they were reluctant, the communists were reluctant to cooperate, they were reluctant to intervene and then to interfere into the life of the church. Everything did change in 1947, 1948. And that did take place because Stalin in person asked the Hoxha to transform the Albanian Orthodox Church, to affiliate the Albanian Orthodox Church to the Russian Patriarchy. And at this point, we enter into the context of the Cold War era. It was the moment when the Orthodox Patriarchate in Istanbul became prominently anti-communist. Actually, the Patriarch of Istanbul at the time became Artan Hoxha. He was a close friend of Harry Truman. He was the head of the Orthodox Church in the United States. And he went to Istanbul with Air One. And in the same time, we have Pope Pius XII, who actually proclaimed an anti-communist crusade. So Stalin understood that Cold War was not just about competing ideologies between, let's say, capitalism and communism, but it was also about, let's say, deep cultural clashes, or at least this is how Stalin understood it. And he wanted to use that. And what Stalin tried to do was to establish an Orthodox front that was based around the Russian Patriarchate to fight both against the Vatican and the Orthodox Patriarchate of Istanbul. So in a certain sense, the competition between rival powers or rival superpowers actually was translated also into the religious sphere. At this point, Stalin asked Hoxha to intervene in the Orthodox Church and to assign at its head people that were trustworthy and that were related to the regime. And what did take place actually in the Orthodox Church in 1948, it did take place a coup, where the previous archbishop, whose name was Christopher Kisi, was replaced by another one, whose name was Paisi Vodica. Paisi Vodica was the father of one of the ministers in the government of Enver Hoxha. And that explains very well, as I was also trying to say before, that many members of the Orthodox clergy were actually cooperating with the communist regime. They were very involved in the communist power structure. They actually did participate even in the communist anti-Nazi and anti-fascist resistance. And so we can see actually how this kind of familial connections were also translated then into the leadership of the Orthodox Church. And so in 1948, after this coup, we see that previous archbishop was actually replaced by Paisi Votica, who went in person to meet with the Russian patriarch, and so he did different visits visited different times the Soviet Union of the time, and so at this point we see a strong connection between the Orthodox Church of Albania, not just with the Orthodox Church of Russia, but also with the Bulgarian Orthodox Church and with the Romanian Orthodox Church. And what happened in Albania, this coup was not only isolated in Albania, the same thing would take place, for example, in Bulgaria, the same thing would take place also in 1947, 1948 in Romania as well. So this was somehow, I'm not saying regime change, but was an elite change within the Orthodox churches of the Balkans in order to create and establish this pro-Russian, pro-Soviet Orthodox front. At this point, the Orthodox Church had a very privileged position compared to the other denominations in Albania. Although there are only 20% in the general percentage of the population, the Orthodox are only 20% of the population. The Orthodox Church, they take subventions from the state, at least 50% greater than the Muslim denominations that are at least 65, 70% of the population. So at this point, the Orthodox Church had actually a very, very privileged position. They could travel, they traveled in Bulgaria, they traveled in Romania different times. They went to the Soviet Union, they went to Czechoslovakia, because there is also an Orthodox Church in Czechoslovakia, tiny Orthodox Church of only 2-3% of the population, but still, so they could travel across the Soviet bloc. And so the Orthodox Church became also a platform and a very important instrument of integration of Albania within this Soviet-led sphere in Eastern Europe. So we can see this creation of the sphere and this transnational circulation of people taking place also in the religious sphere. This privileged position lasted until Stalin's death. With Stalin's death in 1953, with the coming of Khrushchev in power, we see, and Malenkov first before Khrushchev, we see that the new Soviet elite did lose, it lost interest in using religion for its Cold War agenda and Cold War competition with the West. And indeed, actually, Khrushchev started a very strong anti-religious campaign, and thousands of churches were destroyed in the Soviet Union. So in this moment, that the Soviet leadership, post-Stalinist Soviet leadership, lost interest in the Orthodox Church and in using the Orthodox Church for its Cold War agenda, we see that the Albanian communists actually lost as well interest in using the Orthodox Church as an instrument to strengthen their ties with the Soviet Union and with the other countries of the bloc. Gradually, the Orthodox Church normalized. And when I say normalized, I mean it became normal denominations, losing its privileged position. The subventions decreased gradually. And by 1955, 1956, the share it took from the general subventions of the state actually fitted with 20% of the population. So in a certain sense, it was normalized. And it was exactly after Stalin's death, especially after 1955 and 1956, especially with what took place in Hungary, that I could identify a shift in the religious policies of the communist regime. At this point, Enver Hoxha became a more convinced atheist. At this point, Enver Hoxha started pursuing its own original path, its own religious policy. At this point, he actually, in the moment that we see the loosening of the ties with the Soviet Union, because after Hungary, there started many frictions between the Albanian communist elite and the Soviet elite. But the same thing did take place also in Romania, for example. So this greater independence from the Soviet Union was also translated in more regional religious policies. And the Orthodox Church actually was one of the first denominations that suffered from it. It lost the privileged position, it lost the financial support of the state, and gradually the communist state, with the orders of Enver Hoxha in person, it started strangulating the church. It forbade the church to educate its clergy. Enver Hoxha in person said that we need ignorant priests, we don't need educated priests, because otherwise they will compete our ideology. They will spread this kind of imperialist, capitalist, revisionist version. They will somehow become fifth column within our country. So in a way or another, we need ignorant clergies in order to neutralize their ability to compete with our ideological version. And so at this point, after 1956, we could see not only the decrease of subventions and financial support, but also the beginning of a subtle but still persistent persecution of the Orthodox Church from the communist state. But this was not just isolated Orthodox Church. That did take place across all denominations, across the whole field of the religious institutions. So gradually, there is this kind of the better term that I could find is kind of this kind of atrophization. It's strangulated. The Orthodox Church was crippled gradually from the state, and this ability to connect with the flock decreased. And at the same time, the state started increasing its propaganda, especially through the education system. In the education system, especially in the high schools and in the university, there was an increase atheist and ideological propaganda. So the state at this point, after 1956, Enver Hoxha really and the whole communist leadership started thinking seriously about ideologizing the Albanian society. Until 1955, that was not the purpose of the regime. The regime was trying to build the industry, to industrialize the country, to urbanize as much as possible the country, to establish a working class, to create a technocratic class, because they needed that. But at that point, according to Enver Hoxha, what did take place in the Soviet Union, there was a coup of revisionist forces that were hiding below the blanket of socialism. There was this kind of forces that somehow survived, and this because the Soviet Union under Stalin was not able to ideologize the whole society. So in order to save his power and his system, then he thought that we have to go and to intensify the ideological propaganda. And so the Orthodox Church and the other denominations were the first victims of this. And the prominent there was then another increase in the anti-religious policies, especially after 1961, after the break with the Soviet Union. After the break with the Soviet Union with Khrushchev, Albania's main ally became Mao's China in the 60s. So now Enver Hoxha was recreating the whole narrative about the country, about its history, and also he went on with this idea of nation building. Now nation building, not following the Soviet template, but following an original template, a different way of building. In a certain sense, the Soviet Union became Albania's alter ego. So Albania was going to follow a different path, and then that path this path connected with Mao's China, and with the 60s in China take place the Cultural Revolution, and it was within this broader context of so-called anti-imperialist, anti-revisionist front between Albania and China that we see then another intensification of propaganda and ideological propaganda in Albania, and that did actually had a huge impact on religious life. And during the 60s, there were huge efforts from the regime to decrease the power of the church. The number of the churches decreased constantly. The number of the clergy decreased constantly. The regime did, did its best to not allow new blood to go into the Orthodox Church. So the idea was to transform the Orthodox Church and the other denominations into old, dying institutions with no impact to connect with the rest of the society. And at the same time, we have also to keep in mind that Albania was experiencing a demographic boom. Albania doubled in 20 years. Its population went from 1 million to 2 million. So it had a huge population. So 70% of the population were people below 25 years old. So there was also a generational gap between the old clergy and the youngsters who went all into the education system that was totally controlled by the communist regime. So in a certain sense, following the strategy that was crystallized in the mid-50s, by the mid-60s, the communist regime was so successful that actually the Orthodox Church and the other denominations had lost contact with the majority of the population. Actually, the only believe, no, I'm not saying the only believers, but the bulk of the believers were, generally speaking, all where the older people were generally people above 60 years old. So in a certain sense, the regime incited this generational clash, but also creating a gap between the old clergy and the clergy in general that was old, and the rest of the society that were in its majority were very young. And when the Cultural Revolution did take place in 1967, Hoxha took the decision to ban religious life. It disbanded all the religious institutions, and that did not take place. And actually, what did take place? We see no resistance. The disband, the closing of the churches, the destruction of the churches, the banning of the religious life did not trigger any social resistance. Actually, there were only isolated cases that the regime could manage very well. And so by 1967, then, the Orthodox Church stopped existing, like the Muslim community, like the Protestant community, and like the Catholic Church. So what we see then here is a very interesting trajectory. At the beginning, the state was very, very indifferent. There were people from the church trying to cooperate with the regime, and the regime was reluctant to interfere into the religious life. But once the Cold War started, then we see that actually the regime rearticulated its religious policy conforming to the Cold War era, to the Cold War agenda, and to the Cold War actually the dynamics. And it lost its interest in using the Orthodox Church exactly because the trajectories of the Cold War itself. And it was because the split with the break with the Soviet Union and its connection with China, then that at this point then the communist regime rearticulated again its religious policy. So in a certain sense, to understand what did take place in Albania, to understand the religious policy of the communist regime, we cannot focus just on domestic transformations. We cannot really focus only on nation building and state building, but this was a very transnational and global process, actually was affected and was influenced by these global transformations that were taking place in a global world and in a globalized world as was that of the Cold War era. So in few words, this is my book, what this book is, my book is about. I don't want to be boring and keep talking and using names after names after names that nobody of you will ever remember because they're very complicated names. But nevertheless, I just try to give a very concise picture of the history, not only of the Orthodox Church in Albania during the Cold War era, not just about the religious policies of the Albanian communist regime during the Cold War era, but also contextualizing it within a broader global context which is very important to understand what actually did take place in Southeastern Europe. Southeastern Europe maybe is a periphery, but we can have very interesting understanding of the world itself from this periphery, from this borderland, from this land that is a transitional point from east to west, although I'm very suspicious about this division east and west, but still the Balkans are in between. And in a certain sense, this competition is very much done in this borderland. We can understand from this borderland what was taking place in the broader world. And so by investigating the history of the Orthodox Church and of in Albania and the religious policies of the Albanian communist state, we do not focus just on the religious policies of a Marxist and Stalinist fanatic like Enver Hoxha, but we can actually understand broader ramifications and implications of a broader world, because none of the communist strongmen from Zhivkov to Ceausescu to Hoxha was not acting in emptiness. They were actually operating, they were acting, they were devising their policies because they were part of a broader world, and it was the fragile position of the small countries in this titanic clash of the Cold War that in many ways devised their policies. So we do not have to focus only on these small countries, but we can contextualize the broader world in these small countries and understand then how the small countries are related to the broader world. And then we can get what happened with one religious denomination or another. The names sometimes are not important. The process in itself are what are important in this case. Thank you very much.
Oh my God, Artan, I have so many questions, and I hope people in the audience will too, but let me just start with, I mean, it's such a unique, I guess, moment in history, really, or it's such a unique experiment to like actually outlaw, to be we have a lot of state atheism, but it's different from actually erasing, like all churches, all religions, from every kind of sign of them, which did not happen in the rest of the communist state socialist world. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to picture that moment at which you talked about sort of the gradual, there was kind of a period of like, at least over 10 years of kind of fewer resources and fewer people and less education. But I'm still trying to imagine that moment at which, okay, as of now, and so they must have, I don't know, I'm just wondering like what they did with the people, the buildings, like these last sort of vestiges at that last moment. I mean, were those people just put into different positions? Were they put into prison? Were those buildings knocked down? Were they just transformed? Like, what was that last moment like? And also, like, what was the, if any, and I don't know if your research found any of this, but like global reaction to that? I mean, were there sort of outside uproar from the Pope or from, Orthodox leaders or from the Muslim world, or what? I mean, did people notice? Did they take notice?
So you have actually shot at least 5 questions into one question. And actually, I start my book.
I know, but I know you can answer all of them.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
Why I did that.
Absolutely. So let me start with what to live in an atheist country meant. Actually, I have written something. I don't know when I will ever publish it. But I wrote something that what hides in a name. And I take myself, Artan. Artan was an invented name during the communist regime in Iran. Did not exist before. And my name is Artan. And my surname is Hoxha, which is a Muslim surname. Actually, is a title. But in the same time, from my father family, they are not religious, so I can't consider myself and my father's family as Muslims, but nevertheless, this is an effect of atheism, and this is an effect of communism. My grandfather embraced communism, and what he did, he named his son, my father, Roland, after Chanson de Roland. He called my other uncle, Edmond, from Edmond Dantes, from Alexander Dumas, the Three Musketeers, from Conte Monte Cristo. So, and my other uncle, Vladimir. So there was an expansion. So there were not any more religious names. There was a break, a huge caesura, a generational clash that did not start in the 1960s, that did not start in the 1950s. It actually did take place since the World War II. Those young guys of 20 years old that went to the mountains, joined the resistance, at the moment that they left their houses, they left behind a whole story. They just left it forever. And so what happened is that my father's name is Roland. My name is Artan, which is an Albanian name. These invented names after 1967 to create a new man, but also new identities. On the other hand, from my mother's side, they are Orthodox, but they are not Orthodox at all because they don't never go to church. And the idea is that from my mother's side, it's a family that is strongly connected to the Orthodox clergy. Actually, their surname is a religious title, is economy. So I start the book with a story that my mother told me in 1967, in February 1967. My mother, her name is Raimonda, she heard that the St. George Orthodox Church of my hometown was being destroyed. And so after finishing school, they went to see the destruction of the church. And what she remembers is that a lot of people were looking at the moment of destruction and nobody was doing nothing. And the conversation, she told me, started was about the clock of the church. A gossip came out that the regime was going to place the clock of the church in Girocastra, in Enver Hoxha's hometown. And people were angered. Why they are going to why they are not leaving the clock here? It's ours. Let's build the tower and to put the clock there. Why they have to bring the clock there? So that was a moment of shock for me. What the hell happened? Any people lied, any people cried. I absolutely yes. But at the other hand, what she remembers is that at that point of time, the people that were there looking at, staring at the moment of the destruction, there was this very heated conversation about the clock. So people were not caring so much about the destruction of the church, rather about some other elements that they connected and tied to the identity of their home or of their own town. So the church, the shrine, it lose its meaning as a cradle of the town itself, because you know that the towns were established around a small market and a shrine, and then a town grew out of that. Church lost it. So I start my book exactly with this story. And so I try to investigate what did take place. So the thing is that many of the Orthodox churches, many of the mosques, many of the Catholic churches were destroyed. But some of them were left because in a way or in another, the communist regime did need some old temples to give an historical depth to its own nationalist agenda. By 1960, in the 1960s, the communist regime was becoming more and more nationalistic. Somehow it needed some elements to connect to the past. So the problem is that when you go to the Middle Ages, you cannot find anything. You cannot find theaters. You cannot find pagan temples. In a way or another, the monuments are always castles or temples. So in a way or another, the communist regime needed those temples. So at least 400 temples were preserved and were under state protection. But what happened actually was that the communist regime did build a narrative by saying that those temples were built by the local population using the local tastes. So they are not just Byzantine, they are not Muslim, are not Turkey, they do not come from Turkey, they do not come from Latin influences, but they express the soul of the nation. So in a certain sense, there was a reinterpretation of space, a reinterpretation of the symbols of the Middle Ages, because it could not leave an emptiness. Otherwise, the problem was how to create an historical depth for its own idea of building this narrative that the Albanians are the ancient Illyrians coming to our days, but the problem is from the Illyrians to the Albanians are the Middle Ages. So in a certain sense, they needed this connection, this link to connect the Illyrians, the antiquity with modernity. So in a way or another, they preserved 300, 400 temples. The others were destroyed or just were transformed into military barracks, many times into houses of culture. So the temple was there. Its ideological function was the same, but there was just a change in names. So the ideology of religion now was replaced in the same sacred space with the new sacred ideology that was Marxism, Leninism. So to wrap it up, the idea is that living under atheism, I'm a living proof of that. Somehow my name is part of that. After all, there was also these religious policies that the regime was pursuing that actually people of different denominations or religious backgrounds married each other, because otherwise would have never happened. That would have never happened to the generation of my grandfathers, or to, I'm not talking even about my great grandfathers, because that would have never happened. But the thing is that's something that happened after 1945. There were few cases during the interwar era, but they were just few cases. I have seen in the archives, and many times when people of different denominations married each other, sometimes there was the problem that one was going to convert to the religion of his or her partner, husband or wife. But after 1945, people just got married without going to church, and the religious policies of the communist regime somehow helped to merge different religious groups into a wider social entity. And that was then afterwards translated in names, but also names carry an ideology, names carry a history. And my name has a history, and that's the history of the communist regime itself, and also of the Byzantine and the Ottoman legacy in the Balkans. So somehow this is what happened. Then when it comes to the 1967, because of these huge transformations, cultural transformations, generational clashes, generational gaps, but the majority of the population was indifferent to what was taking place. And then the majority of the temples were either destroyed or transformed into barracks or houses of culture. When it comes then to the impact of the wider world, we have to understand that the communist regime in Albania did not even care about what the world was saying, because what was coming from Vatican, what was coming from the Soviet Union, what was coming from Great Britain, from Western Europe, from the United States, was either capitalist or revisionist. They were the enemies. They were the model that the Albanian communist regime was rejecting. So Enver Hoxha did not even care what we were saying. Actually, what they were saying, I'm using the idea of they, which unifies, because according to Hoxha, so the Soviet Union and the United States were just the same thing. They were unified into one single entity of enemies. The more they actually reacted against the proclamation of atheism in Albania, the better was for Hoxha. Because according to him, the more they yell, the better it is, because it shows in a way or another that we are on the right path. From China, nothing like that was coming. Chinese Mao actually was pursuing a very ambiguous religious policy. He closed all the Buddhist, all the Taoist temples, but it left open all the Muslim temples, because at that time, actually, communist China was actually cooperating with Pakistan to encircle India, that was a common enemy. So in a way or another, Mao was not willing to anger the Pakistani. They are still an Islamic republic, so they are very sensitive to that. Enver Hoxha was not in the same position, so in a way or another, there was no let's say, impact on what the world was saying, because Albania was also dependent on the financial support of China. It was not dependent on the financial support of the Soviet Union, was not dependent on the financial support of the Eastern Bloc, was not dependent on the financial support of the Western, of the United States and the Western world. when we go to the Eastern European countries, especially the 70s, once they became dependent on the financial supports, the resources of the West, they had actually to admit also the rules of the human rights. So in a certain sense, they admitted the parameters and the concepts, the juridical concepts of the West. In a way or another, they surrendered ideologically. Hoxha was in a much stronger position because he was dependent on Albania, and Communist Albania was dependent on the financial support of China, and that then had no impact on Albania. I don't know if I answered all this.
Yeah, oh yeah, you
but I
definitely
tried.
did. Thank you for this very long answer. If anyone else in the room, in the Zoom room, has any questions, please raise your hand. Chelsea?
Well, I saw Catalina raise her hand first, so I'll let you go ahead and go, and I'll go next.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see Catalina's hand. Go ahead, Catalina.
Oh, no. Let Chelsea ask her question.
Okay.
That's okay.
All right, go ahead, Chelsea.
I won't eat you, so don't worry.
Okay, let's start with Chelsea
Okay.
then.
Artan, thank you for your talk. I actually have two questions, so I'm just going to ask one first, and I'll come back. Thinking about an earlier period when it comes to religion, speaking more like mid to late Ottoman era. I'm writing my chapter right now about the history of Roma in Albania, which is very little written, as I'm sure you know. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and thinking particularly about Albania, and one theory that John Colsey posed in a piece that he wrote was that perhaps it was the high rates with which Roma in Albania converted to Islam that Albanians and Roma had a different relationship than other countries, particularly Yugoslavia, because of religious practice. And so not that the relationships were always good, but that the relationships were different. And while you maybe don't see as much violence in a public way against Roma because of that. And I was curious if you come across that at all when we think about religion and like inter-Albanian relationships.
So your question is about Albanians and Romas, or about the relations between different religious groups in Albania, because that's very complex. Now about Romas, I'm interested myself, and I'm actually planning to write something about the Israel era, about the Romas. So the thing is that since the 20s, there is an increasing anti-racist discourse in Albania, and the discourse is not coming from educated groups or from the state only, but it's also generated from the society. For example, when Roma groups settled in the neighborhoods of Tirana, the population was protesting to the state. They wanted the Romas out. So the conversion of Romas in Islam, and I don't believe that the conversion of Romas to Islam affected in a way or another the Albanians.
Right.
Yeah, the conversion of the Albanians was should be very much contextualized into specific policies of the Ottoman Empire. And so I don't want to go into there because that's not my period. But I'm just giving you an example. In the second half of the 20s, the Albanian state performed public executions. And the people who executed were always Romans because they were considered subhumans and they did not trigger the blood field from the family of the victim. So the Romas were actually always, let's say, generally speaking, the Roma, there has been a persistent racism among the Albanians over the Romans. And
Okay. But I'm very curious. I'm gonna go back to what you just said about the public executions. So what period were you referencing?
1925, 1929.
to 25 to 29. Okay.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
the public executions were, so the executioners were Roma because they were considered subhumans. And so in the moment that they were considered subhumans, the family's victim was not going to kill them. Because otherwise, if there was an Albanian executing another Albanian, that would trigger the blood feud.
Yes.
So there were these rules, that now we go into kind of a folk culture and the kind of traditional kind of into the traditions of blood feud, which are used to be and still are in certain parts of Albania, still are problematic. But the thing is that there was a tolerance, but the tolerance was from the position of strength. Was not a tolerance because Albanians are tolerant toward the people that they considered the others. For the Albanians, the Romas were generally speaking subhumans, and and in the intro era, I saw documents that the Albanian state, issues orders to not allow Romas coming from Romania and Bulgaria and Yugoslavia in Albania because we don't want Romas. We don't have, so there was an open racism, an open racist ideology and racist legislation toward Romas. Generally speaking, they wanted to place them outside of the cities, outside of the Albanian neighborhoods, so there was a racial segregation.
Yeah, so I read about that. I'm writing that chapter, so that's my chapter 4. But I had not come across. So I have like letters from the 1930s from those who are, Arlie or writing to this prime minister. But I would love to chat more later about the role of executioners, because that's one thing I don't.
Yeah, we can have a conversation. We can Zoom with each other. We can email, and I can give you some indications where to look for.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Very well.
Catalina, do you have a question still? Okay.
Yes. Artan, hi. I'm not a European historian. I'm an Ottoman historian, but I'm almost your neighbor. I was born in Romania and have lived through communism just a little bit. And I remember from my parents all these stories about the great destruction of churches in Romania, which happened especially in the 1980s. And you have spoken so cogently, so nicely about the relations between Albania and the Albanian government with other states and governments. I wonder if there was any connection between these states that undertook such drastic decisions to cut off the Orthodox Church from their possessions, to destroy their possessions, and to also influence in such a way the very ideology of the Orthodox Church that until the communism came in Romania in the late 1940s, really sustained the nationalism of the state. It was, the church has always been in Romania an element of the church, more or less, So this is what I would like to ask you, if there was a connection between, or any conversation between these governments as to how to deal with the Orthodox Church during this period. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. It's a wonderful question. Just let me give you an example. In 1949, the Albanian government actually issued its religious legislation. And guess where they were looking for? Bulgaria and Romania. They asked the Bulgarians and the Romanian counterparts, give us your legislation. So they were not emulating the Soviet Union. They were actually emulating their neighbors. So the thing is, that actually indicates that rather than just look at Bucharest, we have Moscow, Sofia with Moscow, Tirana with Moscow, there are also other alternative circuits of circulation of the models and templates. So, and when it came also to the statute of the Orthodox Church, guess where they were looking for a model? Again, the Romanian Orthodox Church, the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. because they were coming actually also from a similar historical experience.
Yeah, unbelievable.
So, but when it comes to the relations between the Orthodox Church and the state in Romania is a different trajectory compared to Bulgaria, because in Romania, as we all know, the Orthodox Church was actually very much involved in actually also fascist movements.
Yeah.
That was not the case in Bulgaria. That was not the case in Albania.
Mhm.
So the thing is, the reaction of different communist establishments in the different communist countries were different, and in many ways they emulate each other. They circulated experience, but that experience was just was not a parody. Was actually an adaptation to local circumstances and to local context. So what did take place in Albania, for example, in the aftermath of World War II was that they executed only specific people or jailed only specific clergy. The bulk of the clergy was not affected by that. When you go to Romania, for example, Gheorghe Ader's close friend was Justinian Marina, who actually funded him and protected him and sheltered him during the World War II. And guess what happened? Justinian Marina became the Archbishop of the Romanian Orthodox Church. So, but on the other hand, the Romanian Orthodox Church was very much implicated in the Nazi movements. That was not or in the fascist movements. That was not the case in Albania. That was not the case, for example, in Bulgaria. And then in the 60s and in the 70s, what we see is that in Bulgaria, the Bulgarian Orthodox Church became more and more closely related to the communist state because there was an increasing nationalist ideology. Ceausescu was more ambiguous about using religion because he was actually also creating a narrative of the Romanians as descendants of Dacians. So in the same way that the Albanians were using the Illyrians. So we don't need Christianity because we are here before Christianity. We were civilized before Christianity. When it comes to for example, to the Bulgarians or to the Serbs, the idea of becoming civilized societies is strongly connected with Christianization.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to Albania, when it comes to Romania, the idea of having a civilization of their own, it transcends Christianity. So in a certain sense, both Hoxha and Ceausescu did not need very much Christian church for their own nationalist agenda. When you go to Bulgaria, that is not the case. Zhivkov, to articulate its own nationalist ideology and that kind of osmosis between nationalism and Marxism, he needed the Orthodox Church because actually Bulgarians were created because of that Orthodox Church. Yeah. So that's narrative. When it comes to the nationalist narrative,
they did though. Artan, can I just interrupt for a second?
Yeah,
I was
sure.
just thinking about how in both Bulgaria and Romania they started digging back to the pre-Christian, like Thracians and Dacians as well.
Yes,
yeah, like
sure.
yes.
But that was more prominent in Romania and in Albania.
Yeah.
Because in both cases there was this idea of autochthony. We are here from thousands and thousands of years. We are not kind of Slavs. So the idea of Latinity in Romania and the idea of Illyrianism in Albania somehow gave a different repercussion to how nationalism was articulated and how nationalism then was used and the impact of that discourse into real life political consequences for the religious denominations, more specifically for the Orthodox Church in Romania and, for example, for all the religious denominations in Albania. But on the other hand, in Romania, for example, there was a strong persecution against the Catholics and the Protestants.
Mm-hmm. I mean, do you think there was also an impact by the fact that in Bulgaria and Romania, you did have, I mean, there were other religions, but you had really a predominant, Orthodox kind of population, as opposed to having it be one of many. And with Albania having so many different denominations, it was easy enough. It was maybe easier to just say like none of them, like.
Absolutely, and that relates especially with what did take place in Albania after 1961. with the break with the Soviet Union, then Albania was surrounded by countries that were members either of NATO, like Greece and Italy, or Yugoslavia, that was Tito's Yugoslavia, and so another profoundly perceived an enemy, right? So the idea was that maybe they will use these denominations as hit columns. So there was also this paranoia. So there is also this much broader global context, and how Albania, after the break with the Soviet Union, at least in Hoxha's mind, was much more fragile. And this fragility, and from the position of weakness, weakness sometimes produces very extreme reactions. So there was also this much broader global context, but on the other hand, well, 65% of the population was Muslim. So
yeah, it's a pretty big chunk.
But on the other hand, he just erased and banned all the religious denominations, because I think both Romania and Bulgaria were still within the sphere of the Soviet Union. We can understand what Ceausescu, for example, did in the 80s, because Ceausescu was also somehow a maverick within the communist bloc. And so sometimes he pursued also these anti-religious policies in the 80s, where the others were relaxing their religious policies because he was a maverick. Hoxha was another maverick, but he was connected to China. So somehow this alliances very much influenced domestic policies.
Yeah, it looks like Chelsea has another question too.
Yeah.
I have more as well, but let's go to Chelsea.
Assuming nobody else has one, I don't want to.
No, go ahead. Well, yeah,
Okay.
I don't see other hands up, so go ahead.
Okay, so Artan, I also have a question about both the 1940s and 50s, and then into the 60s and Hoxha's Cultural Revolution, because Isa Blumi writes quite a bit about executions of Catholic priests, and in particular the. Okay, you shook your head.
You saying no, they weren't? No, okay.
You did not execute.
Saying they were not. You said what?
Please finish, because I don't want to interrupt you, and then I will answer.
Well, so not necessarily that only Catholic priests were targeted, but he writes about the fact that those who were gay, he argued that they were targeted more. And I was very curious about with increasing attacks on church and religion, what that was like in terms of Hoxha's stance towards those who were in the North versus more Orthodox leaders who would have been in the South. That's why I wanted to hear your take on that. That's what I wanted to hear.
Yeah, I have read Isa Blumi. He's an interesting guy, and he's especially interesting because he doesn't use archival sources, and that makes him more interesting actually. He talks about this. He has this paradigm of South against North, about South being an imperialist position trying to subjugate North. That's an interesting point of view. But on the other hand, there were massive executions of the Catholic clergy in the aftermath of the World War II, but not in 1967. And that those massive executions, they take place not only in Albania, that they take place also in Yugoslavia, because both the Catholic Church in Croatia and the Catholic Church in Albania were profoundly not just anti-Serbian, but they did cooperate in many instances with the fascist and Nazi authorities in a way that the other religious denominations did not do. So Tito, who was a Catholic himself, ordered the executions of many Catholic clergy, as well as many Orthodox clergy, Serbian clergy, because cooperated with Draža Mihailović and the Chetniks. So the thing is that this explanation of North nationalistic, South non-nationalistic, South Orthodox, more connected with the Slavic and the Greeks, and for that reason was kind of against North, it was more. This is speculations that is not supported by the sources, and there are no evidences that in 1967 half of the clergy was executed. There were no clergy was executed actually in 1967. only in some cases there were few people jailed. Okay, of course, it's a huge drama, but there is no execution, and there are only few cases that were jailed. But that's it. So I don't know where Isa Blumi find those sources. I have read him, and yeah. So yeah. So maybe he likes that story so much that he says it everywhere he can. That's okay, no problem. But there are no sources. And when he gives this number, he never gives evidences, and those numbers are never supported by the archival sources. He doesn't use archival sources, so
add
yeah.
that to our list of things to talk about on the Zoom, because I don't reference him a lot, but I feel like there has been, and maybe you might agree. I'm looking forward to your book, but I feel like there's been a gap in some writings about that transition when it comes to religion, which in particular, as well as regionalism. And I just engage a bit to set up the history, to talk about the ethnography. And so I would love to talk more about that. So, and I did want to clarify, he does not write about the executions in 1967. He does write. This is the late 40s. So I just wanted to clarify.
Actually, in the mid 40s. But let me tell you something about regionalism. South and North Albania are not monolithic entities. And when it comes to the support of the Orthodox clergy, the majority of the Orthodox population that supported the communist regime was in southwestern Albania. Pretty much the region I come from. When it comes to the southeastern Albania, which is along the Yugoslav, ex-Yugoslav and Greek border, the support of the clergy, of the Orthodox population, was very ambiguous. There were among them that supported and among them that did not support the communists. And the same thing did take place, for example, also among the Greek minority. There were many members of the Greek minority that were fervent communists that supported communism, but there are also those who were anti-communist and did not want to cooperate with the communists. So the situation is very complex. There is a lot of regionalism, but again, that's not just because the power of the communists were the power of the Southerners, in their majority Orthodox, that joined communism, and then they oppressed North, that were generally speaking Muslim and Catholic. That's like all the simplified narratives. It is provoking, it is good because it gives us kind of food for thought, but on the other hand, it actually distort the complexity of a reality that is not as simple as his thesis claims.
Thanks for that, Artan. Well, we're coming almost to the end of our time, but I do have one last question. I mean, I feel like I could keep it. I could keep talking to you about this for a while, and maybe I'll make my way to Albania this summer or something, so we can have a longer conversation. But I guess I just keep thinking about atheism, especially you're going to write about this. I feel like there's somewhere floating out there narratives of atheists, of Bulgarians being naturally atheistic, supposedly, too, like we never really were, the Christians weren't that Christian, the Muslims weren't that Muslim. Or kind of those ideas actually for other parts of the Balkans. And I've seen some arguments. I mean, these are all really, like, I think kind of squishy, like not, it's hard to find evidence, but that, sort of the further you are from the centers of these kind of religious, kind of cores, like the Pope, like whatever, Mecca, I don't know. The further you are from that, the harder it was for those religions to kind of establish themselves. They never had as many people on the ground. There was never as many resources. And furthermore, since there was these competing religions, things were just a lot more fluid for people, which possibly left them open to kind of potentially becoming more atheistic. And so I just wonder what you thought about those sort of arguments, but also, like, did atheism just work in Albania? Did it work better than elsewhere? Or were people just afraid to say anything when that change happened?
Well,
Yeah, I don't know.
yeah, thing is that from my work now, it's a bit that I'm working on this topic, is that it's very hard to give an answer that says everything, because the thing is, for example, when it comes to the communist opinion, European communist regime, its impact was especially focused in the urban areas. When I talk about the story of Hungary, I'm talking about the story of a girl that came from a certain social group. My grandfather was educated in the Soviet Union, so they were members of a specific group that were connected within the power structure. And so the thing is, their identity was rearticulated and reshaped because of the power relation. And what the communist regime did until the early 60s was actually to make as much, so to obliterate the signs and the presence of the churches in the urban areas, but not in the rural areas. And when we talk about atheism, the real atheism, it starts after 1967. So after Albania was proclaimed a communist country, we see how the communist regime then was devising programs and platforms about what the future Albanians were going to be. That was not the case. So until 1966, 1967, Hoxha just wanted to kind of decrease the power and the presence of the religion in Albanian life. But on the other hand, he did not have any idea what was going to be the Albanian after 50 years, for example, in 50 years from 1967. So then we see that the real atheism starts after 1967. There was all these discourse that we were in the periphery, Christianity and Islam were always the religion of the foreigners. They were far away from there. We're not really true Muslims, never really truly Christians. So pretty much the same thing. So, and we can see how ideas circulate from one country to another, and they are packed again and sold as they are genuine domestic product, but actually they are part of a larger discourse, transnational discourse. But the thing is that when you go to the rural areas, the situation was different, because even the power of the communist regime to reach the rural areas, the remote areas, was not the same as it was in the urban. So when we talk about the story of atheism, how successful it was, then first of all, we have to understand what success means, how we kind of formulate success, what's the definition. But then the other thing is that when you go, the interreligious marriages, I think, are the most. There were few in the rural areas. There were many in the urban areas. Why? Because the working class and the technocratic class were members of this rural, they were these peasants, educated, brought together in the same apartment buildings, their kids going to the same schools. So then we see how these religious identities and local identities are transcended, and the new idea and the new identities were forged. But when you go to the mountains or to remote areas, then the situation is different, because also the ability of the state to reach those areas and to shape the society there was not the same as in the rural and as in the urban areas. So I can say that there is not a definitive answer is successful or not. It depends on the place, on time, and social group.
Well, thank you so much for this answer and for this really wonderful talk. And I hope people will read your books. And we'll be posting this online, a recording too.
Okay.
So
Thank you
and
very much.
I put the link for the Sugarland. You don't have Sugarland with you yet? You don't have a copy yet?
No, I don't have a copy. The copy comes out in February.
Okay.
So yeah.
We'll be watching for that then.
Yeah, and then when it comes out, please let me know, because it's another story and it's not a sad story. Because
Yes.
I'm fed up with stories of the Balkans that talk only about genocides, oppression,
Yes.
violence. No, the Balkans have also a bright story, a story full of sun, a story about people full of energies and energy and will to live life. And There is not just about this dark century that is filled with violence. It's true, there is, but there is also another side of the story. And I think Sugarland tries to say exactly that other side of the story of the Balkans, which is much more global and is much more funny to read. It's not those books that you read those books and then you want to vomit because of all the violence and oh my God, so sad. No, it's a book that you read and then you say, well, it's not just a sad story. There is also another story in the Balkans of societies that are, yes, full of energy and
Well, thanks for ending on that positive note too.
Yeah,
Well,
we have to.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
I
so much.
appreciate it.
And thank you to the audience for coming.